All right. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Media Past and Present, a virtual conversation. I am John Thabiti Willis, Associate Professor of African History here at Carleton College and Director of Africana Studies. And this is the second virtual history department winter Lefler. I'll say something briefly about that before introducing tonight's distinguished guest. Since 1979, the Carleton College History Department has been fortunate to have a special lectureship that is endowed by the Mr. Herbert P. Lefler, class of 42, and Miss Mary Jane Lefler. They were also Carleton parents. This lectureship allows us to bring prominent working historians and others who help us better grasp with the legacies of history to campus, who have recently raised important conceptual questions relevant to the entire discipline of history. Tonight's event offers historical and contemporary perspectives on Black media from two prominent voices. First, we have Professor Kim Gallen, who is Associate Professor of History at Purdue University. Her work investigates the cultural dimensions of the Black press in the early 20th century. She's the author of many articles and essays, as well as a book that is a must-read entitled Pleasure in the News, African-American Readership and Sexuality in the Black Press, published in 2020 by University of Illinois Press. She is a recipient of numerous fellowships and grants, including the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment of the Humanities, and the Spencer Foundation for her work in the Black digital humanities and spatial humanities, as well as in adult education in Ghana. Would love to hear something about that as a person who's a West Africanist. So please join me in welcoming her. I'll now turn briefly to introduce our other distinguished guest, who is no stranger to Carleton at all. The distinguished Brandon Walker is a Carleton alum of class of 2009. He currently works as a TV news reporter at KPRC TV2 in Houston, Texas. After graduating from Carleton with a major in history, he attended graduate school at Columbia University School of Journalism. He has worked as a reporter in New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and now Houston. He is an Emmy and Edward R. Murrow award-winning journalist. So tonight's format, I have a set of kind of questions that I'll use to open up and invite our distinguished guest to engage, a range of topics and themes relevant to this question of the Black press, past and present, right? So I'll begin with Professor Gallen. In surveying African-American history, right? Recognizing that larger context. Can you, give us some insight into how you came to focus on the Black press during the interwar period, right?
Yeah.
Please.
So that's a really interesting story. I want to start off by saying thank you to the Lefler series. Thank you to Thabiti and the other co-organizers of Carleton College. Thank you, Brandon, for joining me in this really important discussion about something, quite frankly, that I never get tired of talking about, which is the Black press. So, thinking about the Black press, a lot of us know it, others don't. Um, your question about why the interwar period is really an important one. And a lot of it stems from my desire to really tell this history about African-American sexuality that has been sort of hidden but open secret at the same time if we think about the way it's covered in the Black press. So I came to studying the interwar period because I was really looking for this story about the ways that African Americans in the early part of the 20th century negotiated their sexual identity and their sexual desires and interests with their identities as Black people, particularly in a time period where the stereotypes of Blackness was rife with these hypersexual stereotypes, right? And I really wanted to get outside of that narrative and get and to engage a narrative where Black people were able to talk about sexuality in ways that wasn't necessarily colored by their identity as Black people in a world that saw them as less than human. And I stumbled, quite frankly, onto the Black press. And what I discovered was a lively conversation, discussion, and negotiation of Blackness within the pages of the Black press. But I'll say a couple other things also is that, you know, the interwar period is this really important period. I call it the golden age of the Black press, quite frankly, and I'm not the one that has coined that, but it's a time period where you see African Americans fashioning themselves as new Negroes. It overlaps with the Harlem Renaissance period, obviously the Great Migration, the Great Depression, and all the way up until World War, up to World War II. And so, you know, you see this idea of a Black press that is fashioning itself as this autonomous institution, and one of the few autonomous institutions, if we're thinking about institutions like the Black church, maybe the historically Black colleges and universities. And so when you think about some of the major themes that come out of the Black press during this time period, obviously you're going to see the ones around advocacy journalism, right? The Black press is at the forefront of fighting for racial equity, fighting against systemic racism, you know, and advocating for anti-lynching bills. But you also see this cultural representations, right? Again, obviously the ones where African Americans are representing themselves as human, as having culture, as being respectable, but then negotiating this idea of urbanization and the rise of greater literacy and sort of crafting itself to meet the needs of a mass readership that was full of diverse African Americans of different class interests, of different genders, of different sexualities. And so in some ways, the Black press becomes everything to everyone. And out of that crafts, you know, multiple Black identities that and communities that overlap with each other. And so I think the interwar period is studied as it relates to the Black press, but we often aren't able to like really dig down and look at some of the nuances of what it means to be Black during this time period.
Wow, thank you so much. That was really rich, and there's much that we could that I'm looking forward to, you know, to really engaging more fully over the next hour or so. Want to invite Brandon Walker into the conversation as well, right? So on your website, Brandon, you quote Baldwin, right, saying, "I am what time, circumstances, history have made me, certainly, and I am also much more than that. So are we all." Right. And so I wanted to use that kind of as a starting point to you know, a discussion about your own inspiration, but also as how you've, you know, seen, because, you know, you were also a history major here at Carleton, right? So, you know, there's some perspective around history that was formed or developed while you were here at Carleton that, you know, picking up on, you know, Professor Gallen talking about the interwar period in particular, right? I wonder, kind of getting your vantage point on how do you see African-American, you see yourself and the work that you do in historical context within that larger, you know, African-American history, you know, if there's more you'd like to say about Baldwin as a major source of inspiration, or, you know, please feel free to take it as you see fit.
Sure. Well, thank you for that. And I'm so honored to be here. And as I said earlier, and a bit feel a little unworthy, but I'm so thankful for the opportunity. And, you know, frankly, to be a reporter, your reports, to be a journalist, you're writing the first draft of what ultimately becomes history, or at least the argument that we call historiography, right? How history is crafted. And so I take that to heart every day. And that's something that I learned in my seminars at Carleton. I think in order to understand reporting, or at least how I see it, my job every day is to understand argument. And that's what historians do. It's your job to understand from where someone is coming. And that's how I apply at least what I do every day to what I do. To get to your question, as in terms of how I see myself as a Black male, how I see myself as a Black journalist, how I see myself as a journalist, and the interconnectivity between those variables. I mean, I think that they are in many ways one and the same, because who I am is who I am, as you referred to that Baldwin quote. What I bring to the table is part of my identity as a kid from New Orleans, right? As a Black kid from New Orleans, as a Black kid who got to Carlton from New Orleans in 2005, flown to Carlton from Hurricane Katrina stricken New Orleans. And so that shapes your perspective as a journalist, doesn't it? Because it's your opportunity to understand empathy and from where people are coming. And it's close to impossible for me to not to understand that empathy without understanding my Blackness, if that's a way to answer your question. And so that's honestly how I approach my job. And it's just at its core, learning to understand from where people are coming. Who cares if you agree with them or not?
Wow, so this is really interesting, right? So, on one hand, Professor Gallen's work, right, invites us to push beyond the kind of politics of respectability, right, to think deeply about, what are issues of major importance to African Americans that, again, try to carve out a different perspective than the kind of, we shall overcome, or the kind of the survival or achievement narrative, right? And then, and then in your own perspective, right, you acknowledge yourself, Brandon Walker, how you thinking about your own identity intersects with how you, that journey that was formative in the moment in which you began to think about history in a very particular way, right? In terms of locating yourself within, this larger, historical perspective as well, right? So, I think, on many levels, there are multiple, issues here to unpack. But the direction I'd like to go in for this moment is, how do you see the Black press in relationship to the larger media through which Black folks are thinking about their experience today, right? So now we have social media that adds a whole other dimension to making available the individual story to now the public, right?
Right, and also the source content too, in that sense.
Yeah, so would love to hear, how each of you, think about, how media, how do you think about media today in relationship to the work that you do, in relationship to thinking about, the implications for the Black press, right? What is the Black press now? How is this, where do you see this, contemporary in relationship to that historical tradition?
Yeah, I'd like to start, and I want to go back before I talk about where we are today, and talk about how the Black press has always been, since 1827, a counter narrative, right? The mainstream, I'm going to just call it the white media, right? Because that's often we use that language of mainstream. We're really talking about a media that has been predominantly written by white Americans, right? And it's funny, these last 4 years, we've just come out of, I'll just say it, a very tumultuous 4 years of a president that constantly, talked about the media, the white media, which is, it's kind of funny, we've talked about the media and the demonization of the media, and the Black press hardly ever entered in that conversation. And I have some thoughts why that is, which I can share in a little bit. But But nonetheless, that was our narrative, right? This idea of fake news and not trusting the media. That's what this past administration had really emphasized. Ironically, right? Ironically and historically, the fake news that has been promulgated by the media has often been fake news about Black people, right? And so that's where the Black press comes out of. It comes out of this notion and this very critical need to tell the story and a news from the perspective of Black people, when the mainstream media, the white media, was promoting, distorting what it meant to be Black, right? And so out of necessity, you have Freedom's Journal coming out in 1827, then moving forward, many other Black newspapers who not just presented a side of Blackness in Black America, they presented and tried to hold up these democratic ideals, as Black Americans historically have tried to hold this country accountable to these democratic ideas. And so this notion of fake news, ironically enough, is part of a mainstream narrative when it comes to Black life. And so that hasn't really been talked about a lot. And I think when we talk about the Black media, I think the white media has a lot to learn from the Black media in terms of being able to call out injustice, right? To be objective, but to this sort of both sides argument that we've seen sort of put out there as objectivity, that we need to engage this other side, even when this other side is clearly lies or conspiracy theories. The Black media wasn't worried. They didn't do that. You know, when there was something that was unjust, when there were human rights violations, they called those things out, and they didn't believe in this notion of objectivity that then would prohibit them from calling out these sorts of injustices. So, you know, I'll stop here, but I have some more things I'd like to say about the where we are today with the Black press, but I don't want to take away from Brandon's time, of course.
No, you're the informed source here, ma'am. Go ahead.
So let's just to keep the narrative going for a brief moment. Can you continue on, and then I'll definitely bring Brandon back front and center into the conversation, right? So yeah, you raised this question of why didn't the Black press enter the national conversation about media over the last 4 years, right?
Yeah.
Please, how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I really think that people have written off the Black press, right? Mm-hmm. That Black media, I would say in the late 20th into early 20th and 21st century, for many people outside of, the Black, and I'm talking about the legacy Black press right now. I want to be clear about this, right? I'm talking about, in many cases, these Black papers that are still being sold in physical forms. But I'm talking about the legacy Black media, Black press. We can talk about these new digital Black media platforms. I think they're important also to talk about, and what we think about as Black media and the Black press. But, for all intents and purposes, these papers have largely been a shadow of themselves. And many people talk about segregation and desegregation, rather, and the civil rights movement and killing the Black press, right? That, our best and brightest were now allowed to enter into these new media rooms and new press rooms. And that takes away from the vibrancy of the Black press. And I agree with that standpoint, but the Black press doesn't even matter enough so that they weren't even a part of these conversations about the role of the media. And you have so many Black reporters, which I don't have anything ill will or anything bad to say about Black reporters who choose to work for mainstream publications or white publications. I think they're needed, but what it's meant though is that the Black press has sort of limped along, just holding on by everything that it can to still exist. So let me be clear that news journalism has transformed just in general because of the internet. So I don't want to make it out that the Black press is something exceptional here. But what I will say is that this de-investment in local journalism and de-investment in the Black press has created sort of this lack of acknowledgement or critical engagement about the Black media. And then finally, I'll say, and then I do want Brandon to say, I don't want to take over this too much. I think when we think about where the Black press is today, I'm really enthusiastic and optimistic. I think because of COVID, I think because of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, I could go on with particularly this last year, we're asking new questions about what it means to be Black. And I think more people are looking at Black media and the Black press, again, not just to tell the story about Black America, but to tell a fundamental story about democracy that I think the mainstream media has completely missed and really sort of flubbed. And I think now is a really crucial opportunity for the Black press and the Black media to engage in these issues around what it means to be Black, but also what it means to be a democracy.
Yeah, most certainly. And I think, Professor Gallen's research speaks to the nuance that was present in the Black press and the multiple conversations that were had. And we all know that, at least as far as mainstream press is considered, the voice or the narrative is oftentimes monolithic, and that this is the Black perspective as far as this voice is, as far as this matter is concerned, from the perspective of this news source. My Comsec Carlton, interestingly enough, delved into that ago, but it is something that we do see on the street here today, and the need to, for instance, I work for, we would call a mainstream news organization, the NBC station here in Houston. And oftentimes in those editorial conversations, the need to, challenge the perspective, for instance, that following the killing of George Floyd, the stories that we do about communities of color have to rely on the fact that they're destitute, using air quotes here. What does that say in terms of, frankly, uplifting a white liberal racist perspective? And what can we do to challenge those tropes? And those conversations, I think, now are being had in mainstream newsrooms a bit more than they were in the past, at least from my experience. I think where we are right now has opened up the door to feel more comfortable to have those conversations, rather to, frankly, I don't bite my tongue in editorial meetings. I'll say something stupid. And I've got colleagues who say that too. And also the ability to bring to the forefront people and groups and organizations that weren't necessarily at the forefront of mainstream news coverage, and also allow for that opportunity for nuance that, okay, well, they're not the NAACP, but they're an organization that's on the street. They may not agree with what the local chapter of the NAACP is doing, but that doesn't mean that there's turmoil, for instance, in Houston's Black community. It just means that there are a bunch of people who think differently, and they happen to be Black, but they all have the same, shared interest in mind, and that is the upliftment of Houston's Black community. And so I think we're at that point now, as you mentioned, Professor Gallen, where we are beginning to see that, but that does not compare at all to the conversations that we saw, especially historically, within Black sources.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with that. I would also say that the National Newspaper Publishers Association, which is the sort of governing sort of body for the Black press in the United States, they have over 200 members. And so the Black press, in some ways, even though, again, as you say, Brandon, is the shadow of itself, miraculously still exists, because I think local Black communities understand the value of having a paper that is directly connected with their needs and their issues. And I always like to tell people that I can't say definitively what white papers or mainstream media was doing, but what I do know is that one of the first task force on COVID-19 was the Black press, right? That the Black press had put out a task force well before we knew what we were facing with this pandemic, because they understood that when this pandemic hit the United States, that Black people were going to be disproportionately impacted, right? It is the mainstream media that started covering the health disparities after the fact, after the data came out. But it was the Black press that understood and already on the ground through communities throughout the United States had a task force that was engaging these issues, right? And so that's not the story that you're going to hear, but Black people and Black communities know that story. They understand the value of these papers, right? When the Afro-American puts out a call, in the early days of the pandemic, asking for money from the local Baltimore community, guess who stepped up and was donating money to that paper to get it through hard times before, Facebook comes in with grants. It's Black communities, right? And so, the problem is, though, is that, Black papers have long had to exist on circulation, right? And advertising historically and contemporarily, and again, advertising is a very touchy thing with all papers, but historically, Black papers could not count on advertisers. They would not, major white advertisers refused to advertise in the Black press. And so the Black press historically has always had to depend on the community to purchase papers, to subscribe to papers. And one of the most interesting things, if you know about the history of the Black press, is they suffer from what was called pass-on circulation. So, one person would buy one paper and that would get passed on to 8 or 9, 10 other family members. And so good for the circulation, but bad for, the copies and everything. So, it is Black communities that have been holding these papers up. But I do think with the rise of social media and the complexity of, quite frankly, of Facebook, right? So Facebook gave out a lot of grants this past spring or last spring to local newspapers, and the Black press, really benefited from that. But then we face this dilemma of Facebook being an incredible bad actor when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, particularly as it relates to Black Americans, particularly around the 2016 election, even 2020 election. So on one hand, you have the Black press propping up, Facebook propping up the Black press, and the Black press, as well as other newspapers, knowing that they're dependent now on the social media for the circulation of these papers, giving these papers grants and funding them, subsidizing them, but at the same time creating conditions, right, for vast types of misinformation and disinformation, not just around election meddling and suppressing the vote, but also around COVID-19 vaccine, right? This sort of disinformation and misinformation that is critical to Black communities. And so these Black newspaper publishers now have to negotiate this very, very tricky relationship with this behemoth of social media, who on one hand is giving them a lifeline, but on the other hand is creating the very conditions, quite frankly, that is causing issues in the Black community. And so it's a very, very tricky balance. Now, the Black newspaper publishers are very aware of this, but then what do you do when you lack the sort of infrastructure and you lack the sort of revenue that your white counterparts have, even your local white counterparts? And so it's a dilemma that I don't know and don't have any answers to. And I'm not a publisher, so I am not here to judge, but I am here to present this as a problem.
And I think, to your point about nuance and the vaccine rollout, a matter with which I took significant issue here in Houston was Houston is in Harris County, and there was a significant concern, and this is something that we've seen nationwide, and the language that's used is vaccine hesitancy and the zeroing in on communities of color, and throwing around, for instance, Tuskegee like it's something we all know. And I think it's easy to say, okay, well, they aren't getting that vaccine because of what that happened then. Well, actually, no. Have you zeroed in on these communities? Have you looked at the pharmacy deserts? Have you traced them by zip code? Have you looked at access to healthcare facilities in these communities? You can't expect people to trust a system that doesn't want anything to do with them. And so if we're going to talk about vaccine hesitancy, what's being done to improve the everyday healthcare existence of people in communities? And what does that say about the numbers or the rates that we're seeing as far as vaccinations are concerned? I think it's just very easy to pitch the argument that, oh yeah, well, historically back then they didn't do it and here's why. Well, no, we're complicit today and here's why. That goes back to when I was referring to frustrations in the newsroom. How do we cover that? It's one thing to say vaccine hesitant. It's another to go to a neighborhood and speak to people who are on the street to talk about the fact that while, for instance, pharmacies are being used primarily to roll out vaccinations, you go to certain communities, there's not a CVS or a Walgreens. There may be a privately owned pharmacy, but they're not in contention to receive the vaccine, which we already know is few and far between as far as supply is concerned. And so that nuance is something that is there in Black press, and that's what we're missing as far as the so-called mainstream conversation is concerned. And that goes back to that further reinforcement of those stereotypes of communities of color, particularly Black communities. And that's just, I use this word, it's stupid.
Yeah, but Brenda, I want to ask you something. So I think you embody, quite frankly, this legacy of the Black press, right? Which is ironic, right? That, you know, now embody in the sort of the reporting style, the empathy, the perspective, you embody all of that legacy of the Black press as a Black reporter. And now you bring it into a mainstream, a white newsroom. And what has happened from my vantage point from reading from Black reporters is that all of a sudden your objectivity is questioned in terms of, can you really report on Black communities as a Black person, right? Where is your objectivity? Now, we never ask these questions about white reporters who report on white communities, right? And so I wanted to, if you could speak to that, but I also wanted to know, you know, given the situation where the resources were there, given the situation where there are papers that could provide the sort of infrastructure that you would need as a reporter, would working for a Black press, a Black news institution, how might that change your reporting? Are there certain battles that you're facing in the newsroom that would it be for a Black press or a Black you wouldn't have to face? If that makes sense.
Oh no, it makes perfect sense, and I'll start with question number 2, and I'll just go back to what you said earlier in your presentation about where the Black press stands today and resources being a significant concern there. To answer your question, yes, I'd go in a heartbeat. And I think that there would be more freedom and less resistance to truly explore the problems with the capital P as they exist. Now, the lowercase p problem into which we would run, I think, would be where those resources are concerned. Money dedicated to time reporting the story, et cetera. And that's where I think we would have a concern, but not necessarily. And we'll talk about more current ways of presenting your journalism today and how you can get around that. To your first point about objectivity, you know, honestly, I'm a reporter who doesn't necessarily agree in this concept of objectivity, right? We all bring biases to the table. It's your job to be fair. And I liken objectivity to like the fundamental theorem of calculus, right? Where X really tries to approach that number and it reaches its limit, but it doesn't quite get there. It tries to get as close as possible. That's what I consider journalistic objectivity to be, where, you know, you're not going to necessarily approach objectivity because we all bring our own biases to the table. And even though we're being fair, they do bleed through. But are you being fair in your assessment of the matter, in understanding the arguments as they're presented? And so that's my approach if I'm answering your question.
You are, but I wanted you to take it a little bit further and talk about if not you personally, the battles that a Black journalist faces in these newsrooms around the types of stories that they are given, the types, again, the attitudes and perspectives that they bring. Because I would argue that the Black reporter, and I don't want to speak in an essentialist sort of way, but I want to go back to that original point that you made when we opened up this conversation. I do think that Black reporters and people of color bring a level of perspective and engagement in ways that often are outside of a white reporter's ability to comprehend, just because of lived experience, which I place a high, extraordinary value in. But I think that very level of engagement also swings the other way with, again, news editors questioning Black reporters' ability to be objective around certain issues.
Yeah, most certainly. And that is something that many a reporter has to deal with. We all have had to deal with throughout the course of our careers. I'm at a point now in my time in Houston, at least, and I haven't been here long, 6 years, but as news jobs go, we come and go. And so I'm at the point now where I'm one of our senior reporters in the newsroom. And so I feel at least that I have the agency to say, God, I don't think that makes any sense. And here's why. And I'm also just at a point in my career and my reporting that if ultimately I feel as though I'm being challenged in a way that's unjust because someone doesn't agree with the perspective that I'm sharing, I do know in 2021, I'll be okay and I can move on to another opportunity. So
Yeah.
that has empowered me to have more of a voice in the newsroom. And I do at least see it as my business to know that it is the job of my editors to trust my perspective, because that's why I'm there. You're there, you're welcome to challenge it, because we're there to challenge each other editorially. But at the same time, as you mentioned earlier, the perspectives that are brought to the table are there for a reason.
Yeah. I think we should let the Biddy do his job. We totally
I'm sorry.
Y'all are doing great. Y'all are doing great. Y'all are doing great. But there's something came to mind to me just as you were posing your question, Professor Gallen, that I'd like to kind of provide another angle into it. So if we think back to, what was it, 2016, right? That election cycle. A lot of people are watching cable news for their news sources, right? Especially large numbers of even college students, right? And college educated folks, right? And that moment when, you had the Melissa Harris Perry show, and then this debate about, was she not angling toward the Democratic Party in a way that, that the network arguably wanted her to angle towards, and that led to, in essence, the canceling of her show, right? And so that example came to mind as I was watching you pose the question around what are the pressures that Black journalists face today, right? Now, I'm not sure exactly where we would see her in relationship to this, and on one level, she isn't the point, but the point is to think about and kind of open up the conversation a little bit to the role that corporate media is playing, right? The role that corporate interests, advertising dollars, right, is playing in shaping how news is covered, and the kind of partisanism that, is so dominating how we as a public engage issues of the media, right? And then I think you kind of opened up with this, a little bit, right, gesturing toward that, Professor Gallen. So I wonder, in relationship to the alternative, from the corporate all the way to the kind of guerrilla journalism, right? What we're seeing, what we've seen happen in the streets, with people using Instagram live feeds, using Facebook Live to report what's happening on the ground, right? What's happening even in a moment of, someone being attacked or witnessing an attack, right? So, in that context, how are you thinking about the role of the media today, journalism happening on the streets, and in, these kind of corporate boardroom, and I'd love to hear just kind of both of you, kind of weigh in on that. Maybe Brandon, you want to start first?
Yeah.
I'll have you, because I've got it. When you said Brandon go first, I was in the process of formulating an answer. So what I'll have you do is just kind of back your question up and re-ask it, because I got lost in trying to figure out my answer when you said Brandon.
Gotcha. No. Thank you so much. So, the situation around the pressures that Black journalists face. And, I thought about that in relationship to that whole debate and conversation, and, that Melissa Harris Perry, and the way in which she, used social media, YouTube, and even other speaking engagements that are now appearing on YouTube to comment on the role that she was playing in how the media broadly, and a Black woman's voice, and a Black, PhD's voice in shaping how, a large audience is thinking about the election cycle, and that kind of political moment. So that pressure on one hand And then, feel free to, to come on the other hand to the kind of guerrilla journalism that we are associating this particular moment with, in addition to all, that was happening at the Capitol and, et cetera. But that guerrilla journalism of people using Facebook live stream, Instagram to, to enter into the media space and shape how people are coming to understand, a moment, an event. And so I wonder, as a Black journalist, right, as a person who's thinking a lot about sources, audience, coverage, perspective, how do you see, the way in which, this kind of from social media to the kind of corporate media, how are you seeing these options? And in relationship to the work that you do, in particular?
Yeah, so most certainly, we're actually in the process of rethinking how we gather room for 2021, and we have and this was all brought to the fore following the killing of George Floyd, in how we engage communities of color, communities. And one of the things that I brought to the table, just being a part of this committee, was, there are all these Facebook groups out there of people here in the Houston area where there is a news headline or something going on. They go out there and they cover them, and they've amassed quite the following, 40, 50,000 people. And it's the perspective traditionally of the mainstream source to turn your nose up at that. But you can't turn your nose up at a source that's got 50,000 followers. You've got to look at what is it that they're reporting and why is it that people are turning to them. And trust is a significant reason as to why they are, because they're covering communities in which they live from where they come, very similar to the origins of the Black press. And so where are we as a newsroom here in 2021 in terms of engaging people who are on the street and have the sources, but frankly have the trust that we don't have because we've ignored wrongfully, excuse me, for I would argue most of our existence. And so now there's this, last minute come to Jesus moment to try to connect with people who have said for a long time, you haven't really cared about me. If it was covering my community, it was perpetuating, for instance, this so-called war on drugs and what we were doing to each other, as opposed to what an overall lack of resources going back to Reagan and Nixon, for instance, led to the desecration of the inner city and what that means. I personally think that there is an opportunity to engage other sources out there that have come up and have the following, have the people who trust them, and for instance, use, say, me, not to necessarily cover the event, for instance, but really delve into why something is of import. How we use our reporters and where they're presented, I think, plays a role in where we're going, especially when the conversation about what, where, and when, frankly, is already out there before we get to it. And I think in welcoming those people and those sources who have the trust of their community into this collective conversation about what's going on is a way of being more equitable in our reach, frankly.
Yeah, I see. Thank you for that, Brandon. And I see someone talked about Don Lemon, the transformation that Don Lemon has underwent.
That's Lavanani, one of my dear friends, was my MPL at Carleton. I saw that question and I thought, oh my goodness. I love you, love.
But conversation about Don Lemon, quite frankly.
There's a lot out there about him.
Yes, but I will say though that just in this last year, and especially with the interest of the Biden administration, you are seeing more in terms of cable news. People like Abby Phillip now that has her own show. I'm forgetting what the name of the show, at 8 a.m. on Sunday mornings. Jonathan K. Carter,
a Carleton alum.
Yeah. Who am I? I'm forgetting. Also MSNBC. Going to kill me.
Joy Ann Reid.
Exactly. So you see the development of these Black media, cable news journalists, shows that are being run, they're highly popular. It would be interesting to talk to Abby Phillip, to talk about Joyanne Reed, Jonathan Capehart. I'm thinking of some other names that aren't, thinking of other people, the names aren't coming to me. Would they define themselves as Black journalists? Like, I think that's a really good question. And like, what does being a Black journalist actually mean outside of just being phenotypically Black? Like, what is the sort of politics that one brings to these particular conversations and shows, right? There's a certain affect, there's a certain aesthetic that we all read as Black, but in terms of politics and thinking about, Black people and Black community issues, I think we need to ask those questions before we make these assumptions. The other thing I would say in terms about journalism in these last couple of years is Hannah Nicole Jones. I think her 1619 project and how that literally created a firestorm, quite frankly, both on some left and obviously on the right, and that being the sort of being the impetus of what the 1717 project, which thankfully has sort of been eliminated through the Biden administration, and just the ways that she's entering as a journalist into these spaces around history and around politics and shaping this sort of American narrative. I think from her perspective and from what I read and what I see about her in a very self-defined Black-centered way and perspective, but it is one that many people have called into question about the sort of expansiveness of what that Blackness means when we're thinking about the diaspora, right? When we're thinking about these histories of colonialism, when we're thinking about these sort of these myths around American exceptionalism, which some argue, I'm not arguing this, I'm just presenting the arguments, that some says that the 1619 project, quite frankly, plays into. So I also think that we need to have some really, really expansive conversations about what it means to be Black and why historically has not the Black ethnic press entered in these conversations about what it means to be Black. There's the Haitian Times, there's these Caribbean newspapers, as well as a vibrant YouTube media, social media that caters to a diverse range of Black people who aren't descendant from, people that were enslaved necessarily in the United States, but can come here through other routes, right? That remain invisible in these conversations, not just about Black press and Black media, but about how COVID-19 impacts Black people, right? We often have Blackness sort of being African-American, right? People who are descendant of enslaved people standing in for what it means to be Black. And I would argue that limits and is a very narrow conceptualization of Blackness in the United States. And I think, unfortunately, the way we talk about the Black press also represents that.
When you were mentioning some of the struggles, or at least the question of whether some of the people that we see in positions of prominence on cable news would consider themselves to be journalists in terms of the information they're presenting. The name that came to mind instantly was Jamel Hill, very much so a journalist, and very much so has not had an easy time in terms of being at the, ESPN made a big deal out of when she was named host of the 6 o'clock edition of SportsCenter. That didn't last long because she was herself. And what happened, despite this big promotional push for it to be the 6, as it was referred to then, an untraditional way of going about talking about the news, although it being very fair approach to doing so, she ultimately had to go her own. And so, where is her opportunity, for instance, in a more mainstream setting? But I think if you would talk to her, I think she's doing quite fine, and she's got it all figured out. I was looking at some of the questions, like someone asked about, Professor Gallen, you touched on this, and just again challenging that monolithic view of Blackness for it being that of a very, I guess, descendants of slave here in the antebellum South type of narrative. Why has this one question, for example, why has there been no coverage in many news outlets on pressing issues in Haiti and one of the largest worker strikes in history taking place in India. There has been Black media organization reporting on these events, but many major news outlets have not. Could you please speak a little about that? And I think, frankly, this is going to sound very blunt, but I think it all comes down to perceived interest and money, and where that goes in terms of the advertising aspect of the business. Frankly, mainstream media is all about what sells. You're selling advertisements in exchange for information that you think people want to hear based on the research that has been compiled in many ways by the advertisers. And so that's my answer to that. And someone also asked, what about Lester Holt? Don't you think his imprint is on NBC Nightly News? Yeah, sure, most certainly. And NBC has gotten to a point now where Lester has a final word at the end of the show. That's supposed to be something akin to an editorial. It's not. It's a bit safe. We're an NBC station, and usually I'm live at 6 o'clock right after Lester, so I hear him in my ear. But yeah, it's been great to hear to witness his growth there. And yes, his imprint is there, and his imprint is also a very interesting one, as you know, a Black man, but also Jamaican American, also biracial, for instance. So that perspective in how he's seen, for instance, as a Black journalist, as opposed to who he is.
Yeah, exactly. Great point, Brandon. Because those were my points also. And I think, you know, I think we have to talk about what representation means and what's the significance of representation, which I don't, as I study representation, and I don't understate its value and its importance, but I do think we have to ask to what end and what do we mean when we say representation, and what is our goal in terms of when we're trying to talk about diverse representations of people who are presenting the news, people who are reporting on the news. And I'm not here to say that to be a Black reporter comes with a certain set of politics, but I just want us to think critically about these categories of Black journalism and Black reporters and the Black press, and ask, you know, who and what are we really talking about when we say that, particularly as we think about how history shapes how we think about the present.
And back to your research, Professor, sexuality is also akin to that too, right? If we want to use it, not to pick on Lester, but to use Lester as an example, beyond Lester being a Black man, Lester fits that very traditional straight-laced role of an anchorman. Interestingly, in many ways, his predecessor, Brian Williams, did not. And so you can argue that Lester is a very safe answer to the role of anchor on the NBC Nightly News, for instance. But have we seen someone who doesn't necessarily identify as a straight cis male of color in that position of prominence? No.
Yeah.
We're seeing that at least on Sunday mornings on MSNBC, for instance, with Jonathan Capehart and his show. But you know, we're not seeing that in the more traditional role of the evening newscast, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point.
So two quick questions, and we're bumping up against the hour here. So one, what Black media sources would you recommend, Professor Gallen, and Brandon as well? Feel free to jump in. There were two questions about that.
If we're talking about some of the new Black media, I love the Griot, you know, I think, and we never even got a chance to talk about ownership. I have to put in a little conversation, I mean, just a little bit of a comment on ownership. I mean, I think when we talk about how the Black media and the Black press has changed, I think, you know, ownership was a staple of what it meant to be a Black newspaper, to be a part of the Black media, Black press historically. That's changed in these last, you know, late 20th, 21st century, where now we're talking about Black oriented media, we're talking about Black audiences, right? I come from an old school where I think ownership, it still matters. I don't think it necessarily defines whether media is Black or it's a Black publication, but I do think ownership matters. I think it gives autonomy and agency in ways that I just don't think you're going to get without ownership. But I would say, to go back to the original question, you know, I do like, you know, news outlets like again, the Griot, the Plug, I think those are really great. New Black Media. I'm a particular fan of Legacy Black Press, the Afro-American. I have to give a plug for the Indianapolis Recorder being here in Indiana, and the Philadelphia Tribune. I mean, if you're thinking about supporting local journalism, these are really important papers who I think have done a really good job, particularly the Afro, of making that transition from print to digital and how they are, framing the news.
Right. I mentioned those sources. I would add to it Blavity, for instance.
Yeah.
Also a good source. Here in Houston, we still have the Houston Defender. It's primarily digital. Active conversations are still there.
Yeah.
I often dive in to see what's being covered and how it's being covered, and how we can use that, for instance, as a marker for our coverage.
Yeah, yeah, and the Root is good also. I mean, a lot of
Right.
people read the Root also. So.
Well, unfortunately, our time has come to an end. This has been such a stimulating conversation. Thank you so much for being such exceptional panelists, intellectuals, thinkers.
Is it a hard stop, Professor?
It is for me.
Oh, yes, it is. I'm sorry.
I have children that will go
Yes.
wild. They turn into gremlins after 8, and so if I'm not there to corral them, who knows what's going to happen in my household. So I apologize about that.
Well, they turn to gremlins. I turn to a pumpkin after a certain time.
Well, again, thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I hope we have future opportunities in which to engage these and other questions of major import. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A moment to hang around, that would be great.
It was all mine. Thank you, and
much.
thank you everyone for participating.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.